Entre tantas conquistas na sua carreira está o plano para Nova York. O que você destaca desse trabalho tão notável?
Well, developing a long-term plan for New York City, which I started as part of the Bloomberg administration in 2006, was an ambitious effort on the part of Mayor Bloomberg to rethink how we thought about the future of the city. New York City, for 50 years, had shrunk in size and then it had grown back, but always below what its peak population had been, which was about 1960. And in the 2000s was the first time that the city grew beyond the 8.1 million people it had had then. And so what we started doing was thinking about the future of the city from a number of different aspects, from sustainability, from capacity, from quality of life, all of which was intended to make the future of New York work better for a larger number of people than it did for a smaller number of people today. And there were a number of key components to it. Investing in our transit system, making our energy system more efficient, especially reducing the energy that's consumed in our buildings, thinking about the impacts of climate change that climate change would have on New York City, and particularly addressing the environmental quality of the city. Most importantly, air quality, because that is the one we can't escape.
Essa foi a receita para Nova York. Agora, quando se pensa na cidade ideal, quais são os primeiros passos? Por onde se começa?
For any ideals for any city?
Yes, any city.
Well, there are two things that you have to start with when you think about the long-term future of the city. Right? One is actually understanding in a rigorous way the current situation. Right? And one of the things that I've seen around the world is that cities do not have the data that they need about their own situation. They don't know where their energy is going. They don't understand their traffic patterns actually as well as they may think they do. They don't even, in some cases, have good population data or know who is living where. Right? And you do need that, because if you can't quantify something, you can't project it, you can't manage it. The second is actually to understand what makes a city different. And I think this is one of the mistakes that many planners make. Cities are all different. They have unique strengths, they have unique personalities, and the populations of a city want different things. And so the successful plans, whether it's about sustainability or architecture or whatever it is, understand and encapsulate that local personality.
Muitas cidades no Brasil estão diminuindo de tamanho, estão enxugando, especialmente porque faltam oportunidades para os jovens que vão para outros lugares. Como resolver esse problema?
It's true for every city, and I know a little bit about Brazilian cities, but in all cities, you need access to opportunity, right? That's the most important thing, and it's the responsibility, I think, primarily of city government to make sure that access to opportunity is equally distributed. That takes a number of forms, right? One of the most basic is transportation. We find it in New York, we find it in cities around the world, that transit is generally most accessible to the wealthier neighborhoods. And so we have to make a conscious effort to improve the transit links for lower income neighborhoods. That's one. The second is technological access, right? If you have lower income people who do not have access to smartphones, to the internet, they are going to be disadvantaged. And I think those are two areas. What's interesting is that housing, utilities, some of the other challenges that traditionally have been the focus of what cities do for lower income people, it's not less important, but that's about the current quality of life. What actually creates that future opportunity is the transportation access, the internet, the telecom access, and then that is built on two fundamental things that disproportionately hurt the poor when they are done poorly. One is public education, and the second is corruption, right? Which at the end of the day, well-off people can buy their way out of the education system, and they can either afford or they can circumvent, and in some cases they can profit from corruption. But both of those injure the poor the most.
Tudo que você está dizendo são receitas básicas para o crescimento de qualquer lugar. Como cuidar da qualidade da administração pública?
In order for a city government to achieve this kind of smart thinking, this good management, you need a couple of things. Number one, you need an ambitious chief executive. At the end of the day, so much of this depends on the mayor himself or herself, because that person sets the tone for what happens inside government. I think you still need a couple of other things, and there are some things that mayor needs to do. Number one is encourage his or her staff to think both about policy and politics at the same time, right? Many places I see when I go around the world, the mayor has a set of political advisors and a set of policy advisors. That doesn't work, because what does that mean? The political people are always making the deals and thinking about the image. The policy people may be wonderful policy developers, but they might be unrealistic. They might not be thinking about what will actually help the mayor move a political agenda forward. At the end of the day, running a city is a political and a policy project, and it's interwoven. So that's one of the things the mayor really has to drive. Everything has to make sense on the merits. It also has to work with the political reality of the city you're in. I think there are a couple of other things, right? One is you need a mayor who is open to new ideas, but also has a strong sense of his or her own priorities, right? That's what attracts a good staff, is not somebody who's a blank slate, because that's not an exciting person to work for, right? But also not somebody who is stuck in their ways and uninterested in learning, right? And if you can have that correct balance of somebody who's looking for the right answers, intellectually aggressive, deft in terms of managing the political scenario, you can attract really good people to city government.
Quanto que as mudanças elas são dependentes do governo central? Você pode usar Nova York como exemplo para ilustrar.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges facing cities all over the world is the extent that they rely on other levels of government. We have that problem in every country. In the United States, I know a little bit about it in Brazil, whether it's Australia or India. This is a big problem, because one of the challenges is that the political agenda and the policy imperatives of a city and a metropolitan area do not work hand in hand with the politics of a national entity, right? And whether it's the United States or Brazil, we know that the needs of Paulistas and Cariocas and New Yorkers and Washingtonians or Angelinos are not the same as those of the average Brazilian and the average American, right? And so what you want to see is city governments both being large enough that they actually have control over, say, at least about 50% of the metropolitan area, which a place like Rio and Sao Paulo certainly has. We have it in New York. And that they have the ability to act independently, to raise their own taxes, to manage their own critical infrastructure. You see countries around the world where the national government runs the local transit system. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you have that mismatch in terms of the power and the usage of a given piece of infrastructure or a given service? So you want to reduce that dependence on the central government as much as possible. In some cases, that requires creating metropolitan organizations. I'm quite hopeful that what's being done in Rio in terms of the metropolitan entity that's being created around Guanabara Bay can do some of that regional planning and transportation development. It's the kind of institution that we struggle to have here. We have a little bit of it in New York, but we don't have the kind of regional planning that we ought to.
Você acredita que é possível as cidades se organizarem de maneira independente de um comando que vem de cima, ou seja, num sistema bottom-up, que as pessoas se organizam de maneira independente?
I think at the end of the day, coordinating the lifestyles, the activities of several million people that you have in a major city requires both, right? It cannot be a top-down only bureaucratic or technocratic approach, because a city is a human society. It's a human, a diverse human organization. At the same time, it cannot simply be organic, right? And I don't believe that organic, whether it's democracy, whether it's crowdsourcing, there's incredible value there, but you cannot assume that systems self-organize in an optimal way no matter what the system is, right? And so what you really need is this, I call it the porpoising back and forth, right? So government, the top-down layer, cannot move forward in certain areas, right, on certain topics, until there's a certain understanding or acceptance or demand or whatever it is from that grassroots, right? But at the same time, that grassroots initiative cannot solve every problem, right? And therefore, part of its power is simply to change what is demanded of the top-down layer of government and to set the boundaries on what it can and cannot do.
No Brasil, 39% do esgoto da água é tratada. Diante desse número, qual a sua opinião sobre um país que apresenta um número como esse?
Brazil's problem of not having a complete sewage system, it is unfortunately, I think, a negative commentary on the state, particularly of municipal government in the country. And you know, in fairness, the United States has only gotten to a point of 100% sewage treatment over the last 30 or 40 years, right? So
really?
it's not like the United States solved this 100 years ago. And what it required was a massive federal investment, actually, and the setting of national standards. So this was an example, a bit counter to what I was just saying, I will confess, where the national government set standards and forced the municipal governments to comply in a really rigorous way. People were put under, prosecution from the federal government, individuals in charge of city agencies. If the agency didn't comply, the individuals were held accountable, right? And sometimes you have to go to that level. It did also require unlocking massive amounts of financing. In some cases, it was grants. What we now have in the United States is a system of loans. And what that was all based on, though, was the fact that all of our water, virtually all of it, I can't think of a place in the United States now where the water is free. And ultimately, unfortunately, the reality is you get what you pay for. And in places where either the water and sewage company or whichever institution is responsible for it, if they are inept or if they are corrupt, you will get a situation where the sewage is untreated. You will also have that problem where the politicians are unwilling to ask people to pay what it costs to deliver those services.
O que seria, na sua opinião, uma sociedade ou uma administração pública organizada que seja sustentável?
A sustainable public administration, certainly at the municipal level, would be one that is that has enough direct control over its sources of funding and financing that it can act in a way that is not always secondary to whatever a national government or another entity tells it what to do. A sustainable public administration has to be mindful and attuned to what the public needs and wants, but is also willing to challenge public opinion. Right? And I think it's true the world over that the general public respects leaders who lead, and after a while they recognize people who simply follow. Right? Now, you can't be crazy, you can't completely challenge every assumption or every desire that the public has, so change comes often in staccato forms. You move faster now, you move only a little bit at other times. Some of that's dependent on the skill of the leader, but you have to have, it goes back to what I was saying about the porpoising, you have to have a leader who is willing to push public opinion, and hopefully public opinion will follow, but doesn't get too far in advance. And then I think the final thing, and it relates to what I was saying about the financing, for a public administration to be really sustainable, it has to be well organized internally, right? So the individuals have to be incentivized and managed well. That means they have to be held to the highest standards of transparency to keep things clean. They have to be able, though, to make a decent living, right? And one of the problems you have all over the world is when civil servants are actually underpaid, right? And then that underpayment leads to the justification for asking less of them, right? And so if your teachers or if your bus drivers are underpaid, people will say, well, how do we expect them to produce? But in fact, the way you get them to be worth more is to manage them aggressively, just like you do in a well-run private corporation.
Você acha que o plano diretor ele deve ser de uma cidade, ele deve ser mudado, ele deve ser adaptado ao longo do tempo?
A good master plan has to strike the right balance between a long-term view, because you can't plan something as big as a city only looking 5 years in advance. But it does have to be able to react to change, right? Because technology evolves. If you had developed a master plan for any city 15 years ago, you would not have assumed that smartphones... Yes, exactly. So there's new technology. So what I think you need to do is build in periodic updates. So what we tried to do in New York, and it has worked thus far, is we said we're going to have a 20-year plan. Every 4 years it will be updated. And then there will be a 4-year period when there are no changes to the plan and it's just about executing on the plan.
Mas existe uma diferença em adaptação e mudança do plano diretor.
It's an interesting question you just asked. That's right. So the way I think about it, if you're really changing the plan, it means probably your objectives changed in a fundamental way, right? And either that's because your city changed quite fundamentally, which happens, right? You could have a massive influx of immigrants from a new part of the world, or an entire new industry arises all of a sudden that wasn't there only 10 years earlier, and so the needs and the character of the city change. You see that, but not regularly, right? Certainly not in a mature city like a New York or a Rio that's been around for several hundred years. Those things only happen occasionally. More often what you have is that the tools, the specific needs, the macroeconomic circumstances change. And that I think about as being more in the way of adaptation, right? So we know that we can make buildings more energy efficient, or we can manage our transit system very differently than we ever imagined when we were developing Plan YC only 9 years ago, because of big data, because of the Internet of Things, all of that. But that's an adaptation. We still know we need the traffic to move better. Our subway needs to be more efficient. Our carbon emissions need to be lower, right? So that's that difference. One, I think, is a change in goal. Exactly. The adaptation is how you use the tools you have and react to the circumstances you find yourselves in to get towards that goal.
Gostaria de saber agora, com relação a esse fluxo migratório no mundo, como as cidades têm que, se é possível as cidades se prepararem para receber essa onda de imigrantes que estão se deslocando pelo planeta, enfim.
Well, in most cases, immigration is a wonderful thing for cities, right? Certainly the renaissance that you see in many American cities over the last 15 or 20 years, certainly it's the case here in New York, has to do with international immigration dramatically increasing in the 1980s into the United States. That has changed our neighborhoods, it has changed our economies for the better, because immigrants tend to bring entrepreneurship. They are eager to set up small businesses that often natives are less likely to do. And they bring the kind of diversity that makes our cities more interesting, right? And whether it's ethnic food restaurants, or whether it's art, or whether it's the creative scene, right? New York City certainly is richer for it. London is richer for it. When they come in huge waves, of course, there are the infrastructure challenges that large numbers of people bring to any city, and it doesn't matter whether they're moving from only 50 kilometers away or they're moving from around the world. And that is one of those places where you need the kind of central planning and authority from a municipal government primarily that will think not how do we forestall these people, how do we keep them outside of our city, how do we kind of make them permanently temporary, which unfortunately is the mistake that many Brazilian cities made for a long time, many of the cities in Africa have made for a long time. But with the work that I know has been going on to good effect in places like Rio and Sao Paulo, to own those informal settlements and make them more formal is actually the way that our great cities around the world have been built.
That's true.
right? So here in New York, one of the things that happened when New York was going through its dramatic expansion between, say, 1880 and 1920, is both the city of New York and then Brooklyn, which was a separate city for part of that period, were building sewer lines and laying out streets in the middle of open fields where nobody knew who was going to build the houses, but they knew the population was coming. And what that meant is that when those buildings were built 5 or 10 years later, they had good sewers, right? They had running water. They had the conditions that took these immigrants who might have arrived with virtually no money and helped them quickly become prosperous, upstanding members of society, and therefore contributing a great deal, and not creating a permanent second class of citizens, right? So unfortunately, that requires a lot of capital. But if you can harness that economic growth that comes when people arrive, you can do it. Now, what does that require? It generally requires the kind of transparency, the rigorousness of revenue collections, the willingness, for example, to get people into the formal economy, because that's how you pay for it. So if all of the informal, had anybody who came to New York and started a business been in the black market, right, and not paying taxes, New York City would have been unable to borrow the money and pay back the loans that it had spent to build the infrastructure that served those people, right? So some of it is actually having that robust formal sector of the economy that you bring people into rather than keeping them into that black market, that informal, which doesn't grow.
But the important point is that these people, it's not a second class.
It cannot be. That's the worst possible outcome when you have two cities living side by side. One is the dystopian outcome. Not only is it reprehensible for the people who are stuck in that second class, but you wind up in a conflict over time, right? And whether it was the terrible crime rates that so many Brazilian cities saw, whether it was the race riots that American cities suffered in the 1960s, you can never have two groups side by side and one being rich and one being poor without it being devastating. But the other thing is, it's inimical, to what makes cities work, which is synergy, having lots of people who derive efficiency and productivity and benefits from each other because they are near each other. If you have apartheid in any way, right, you never get that. And so it's kind of pointless because you're crowded, but you're not gaining from each other's presence.
But it's a challenger in this moment, Edward.
It's clearly a challenge, but it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge, right?
Yeah.
It's always a challenge to integrate people who are different or have different backgrounds or have different experience, and again, whether they're coming from the rural parts of your own country. And there's no city on earth that over 50 years has found that it's a good solution. It may seem right to the privileged few who often can control municipal government for a period of time, but it never turns out well in the end, and in fact, everybody is poorer for it over time.
Quais são os efeitos de uma cidade mal organizada nas necessidades do dia a dia? Como que esses efeitos vão atingir quem vai para a escola, quem vai para o trabalho, na vida familiar dos moradores de uma cidade mal organizada?
The difference between a well-run and a poorly run city, it's pretty obvious and it's pretty pervasive, right? You can see it in the experience in our shared spaces most of all, right? So what makes a city so powerful and so efficient is that people who live in cities share things, right? Whether we want to or not, right? So I live in Manhattan. I don't have a backyard. My backyard is a park. So I go to Central Park, which I share with several 100,000 people on a sunny Saturday afternoon, right? But that's very efficient, right? So rather than having my own private backyard, we share a park. I don't have a car. I share a subway car or a bus with hundreds of other people, right? And so that makes us use land much more efficiently. I'm more likely to eat out at night than cook, and therefore I share the restaurant space, right? So all of those things make urban dwellers more efficient. And those are the shared spaces where you see the quality of a city, right? You share the air, right? How clean is your air? That's an interesting indication because that's about the coordination in the government. You can't really crowdsource clean air. It has to be something that's done by government. Are the streets clean? Are the pavements well repaired, right? Those are the things you're going to see in that shared space. Are the parks well maintained? Is the public realm safe? Is the public transit functioning? Are the public schools producing good outcomes? It's that shared space. And so when you have a poorly run city, the two key indications are that wealthy people retreat behind walls and into the suburbs, right? We saw that here in the United States in the 1950s and 60s when our cities emptied out. Again, when Brazil had the height of its crime problems in major cities. What do you see in every rich neighborhood in Sao Paulo? You see big walls around the apartment building, right? Which indicates that the private space is good and the shared space is not good, right? And that's a terrible indictment of how those cities were run for a long period of time. And so on the flip side, when you go to a city like Rio, which I love, and increasingly it does feel like the neighborhoods are safer and people are more comfortable out on the streets, that's a very good indication that things are getting better. There's still a long ways to go. There's still a long ways to go here in New York because the city is a very complex organization. But nonetheless, I think you can judge the quality of a city's government by the condition of its shared assets.
Eu gostaria que você desse algum bom exemplo que a gente pode destacar no Brasil como bom exemplo de sustentabilidade.
Of course. Well, look, the whole world right now is paying attention to Rio de Janeiro. Right? It is the Olympic city. It was one of the key World Cup cities recently. And what Rio has done in terms of particularly its transportation system is, I think, a wonderful example of what so many cities should follow. And I think what I see as most admirable about it is the extent to which the transit system has been developed, the BRT system particularly, to help reduce the wasted time that particularly the poorer members of society spend in getting to work, right? Because one of the critical things that we see, both in terms of the economy and in terms of the environment, is this time penalty, right? So there's this concept of time poverty, where if I'm well off, I can pay to save myself time, right? And that's a terrible drag on the quality of life and the opportunity of the lower income portions of society. So I think in Rio, what Mayor Pius has done, I think, so well is think about how do you speed up the buses that serve some of these longer commutes, and at the same time, can you attract some of the middle class that has the option to drive to the expanded metro, to the BRT, simply because it's still faster than driving. So I think that's one example. I think similarly what Sao Paulo is now trying to do in terms of reducing auto reliance is critical. And it is going to be one of Brazil's fundamental challenges, whether it's for carbon emissions, whether it's for quality of life, whether it's for the productivity of the urban areas. And there are few countries around the world that are as heavily urbanized as Brazil, right? And now that the Brazilian economy is at a level of development where the majority, certainly, of Brazilian families can afford a car, right? You actually have this real problem of how do you redesign cities that last time they were really thought through, there were relatively few cars because only rich people who owned cars, right? And it's the same problem that China has faced. I mean, if you look at what has happened in Beijing, where 20 years ago it was a bicycle-dependent city, now it's one of the most heavily traffic-congested cities in the world, right? It's about that growing wealth when the capacity of the road system and the smartness of the transportation system didn't keep up. I'm sorry, I got a little bit off topic on this, but so I think the BRT system in Rio, I think the efforts in Sao Paulo, and then I think actually, what Mayor Pius has been trying to do in terms of making the historic downtown, the Porta Maravilhosa neighborhood of Rio, more attractive is also really important. Because at the end of the day, you cannot have a truly sustainable city where the center is not more dense and more attractive than the surrounding regions, right? That's how you get the kind of travel patterns that actually allow people to take the metro, to take commuter rail, things like that.
Quer dizer, é uma necessidade de dividir todas as qualidades de uma cidade entre todos, é isso?
I think so, and you know, one of the key things that I think has changed for us here in New York over the last 20 years is 20 years ago, people who were in the suburbs in New Jersey or in Connecticut or on Long Island, they looked at the problems of New York City as being unrelated to them because they didn't actually like to come to New York. It was too dangerous. Maybe they had to commute into Midtown for their jobs, but they went home as quickly as possible and they weren't here. Now it's very different. Now people come in on the weekends. People love, if you live in the New York City suburbs, you want to be in Manhattan on a regular basis. So Manhattan has once again become a shared asset for the entire region, right? It's a wonderful thing for the city, and it's the kind of thing, you know, a place like Rio has it because of the beaches to a certain extent, but nonetheless, you still need that commercial district downtown. And it organizes both the physical patterns of the city, but it actually also creates that kind of civic culture of what you all share being part of a given city.
Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to run.